Welcome to the Think Factory podcast. We got one question for you. What keeps you up at night?
Welcome back to the Think Factory podcast, powered by OGC Solutions. I'm your host today, Chris Santamassimo, doing another on-the-road and on-site episode. I'm in Woburn, Massachusetts at Hannaford and Dumas, and I'm really excited to sit with Bob Stewart. Bob is, first at Hannaford and Dumas, he's a senior account executive. And we're going to talk a lot about him and Hannaford and Dumas, but the second Marine Corps veteran who also got into the printing industry to join us for the podcast.
Yes.
So welcome.
So yeah, I was. My family had started.
Hold on a second.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no problem. I know you're ready to. You're locked and loaded. Ready
sorry.
To go at all times. No. I just wanted to say that Rich Vale, who was another guest on the podcast, was nice enough to introduce us. You guys served together, etc. Mm-hmm. So I'm always really interested to talk to veterans because I love how, in your case, the Marine Corps, but the military in general sort of shapes a person and prepares them for whatever their civilian life is too.
Yeah.
So would love to hear a little bit about your background, and especially let's talk about what you're doing for customers at Hannaford and Dumas.
So my background is I grew up in Hyde Park in Boston, which was it's a kind of a rough and tumble part of the city, and in the mid 70s busing was going on, and it was a really rough time to be in the city. And my parents wanted to get us out of the city. So, and my dad had started he was working at a company called The Wright Company in Cambridge, second shift. Mm-hmm. And first shift, he was running this business that he was trying to get going out of his house in Hyde Park. And he somehow landed, it's a department store called Bradley's, which is no longer in business.
Sure.
And Bradley's used to do like a circular in your paper, but instead of using real people imagery, they did it with like when I say cartoons, it was just colored.
Yeah.
And so we would get a box of stuff at our house, albums, clothing, and there was about 5 women down in my basement who would then using film and rubelith and screens would look, oh, this is an album, and they would recreate that
for the circular.
For the circular,
yeah.
And the great thing was, Bradley's my dad never had to take that stuff back, so I'd be like, oh, that album, that's a whatever album. I'm and I get to keep it, and my mother would be like, oh, I got these slippers now, and I'm going to get to keep those. But then my dad moved the business in '78 to New Hampshire. One, for tax reasons, because of there's no income taxes in New Hampshire. There's business taxes, but they're not as stringent as Massachusetts. 2, because of that issue with busing, he just wanted us to get us out of Boston. So I started, and I was from the time my dad, going back to when he did start it in Hyde Park, my dad had my sisters, my two younger sisters, we would be taking screens off of flats and putting them back in. There'd be a box of 10, 20, 30, 40, the percentages of the screens. And as long as the film was a good chunk, my dad would teach us to take it off, pull the red tape off of it, put it back in the box so the ladies could reuse it because it cost money, and that just,
Sure.
So then now I go into high school, I'm working for my dad, learning the pre-press business. But at the same time, ever since I've been, knee-high to a fence post, I've wanted to be a Marine. I want to enlist in the Marine Corps. My mother doesn't want me to enlist. She wants me to go to college. I don't want to go to college. I just want to be like some of my cousins, that were Marines. My dad was a Marine, though he wasn't an active duty. He was only a reservist. But my mother, she's pushing me college. So it makes me decide to look into commissioning programs for the Marine Corps. I start realizing about ROTC. I realize about the Naval Academy. My dad I want to say it was Judd Gregg, was a senator in the United, wrote a fantastic letter to Joe Hughes, a New Hampshire senator. Judd Gregg nominated me to go to the Naval Academy. But I wasn't a great athlete, I don't have, my grades were kind of top of the second third of my class, And so the Naval Academy was go, you're just not cut from the right, you need to be either a rocket scientist or a great athlete.
Right.
But then I start looking into, I still want to go to a military school, So I start looking at Norwich, the Citadel, and VMI. And I get accepted to all 3 of those schools. And I'm thinking about going to VMI because I love the Civil War and it's down south. And I'm thinking about going to the VMI. And a guy I worked with who was maybe, say, 6-7 years older than me, goes to Virginia for some reason, stops in the town that VMI's in and says, hey, a buddy of mine wants to go to VMI. And again, this is 86, 87. And they say, Yankee? Oh, we'd love to get him down here because, it was 40 years ago, but there was to some degree vestiges of the Civil War going on. So he comes back and tells me that, and I'm like, yeah, you know what? Norwich is 2 hours up the road. I can come home on the weekends when I want. So I go to Norwich. Definitely a life-changing experience because I remember I checked in and I had to go meet my first sergeant, and the cadre, the cadets that are about to be the ones that really become your drill instructors are sugary sweet to your parents, and because my mother took me up there, my dad couldn't get up there, his back was messed up, and they're like, oh, you gotta meet the first sergeant, come with me. And I'm like, oh, all right. As soon as I got out of sight of my mother, yeah. I was up against a wall. I was being screamed at with words that were things that I wasn't used to hearing. So I meet the first sergeant. I go into a room, guy sitting at a desk, swords crossed on the desk, blanket, it's dark. I walk in, I was taught, knock on the door, twice, stand on the X, say, recruit Stewart reporting to First Sergeant Huggins as ordered. I still remember that. Mm-hmm. I knock 3 times instead of 2. I walk in, I start to say what I'm trying to say, and I mumble it a little. And out of the shadows of the room, what I don't realize, there's 5 other people in that room, and the next thing you know, they're inches from my head, screaming at me, I get, within, it seemed like it was 15 minutes, but it was probably less than 10. I get to go out. I come back to my mother. I proceed to, as I'm talking to her, every other word out of my mouth is words I learned when I was in Hyde Park. And my mother looks at me like I got lobsters coming out of my ears. Like, what is wrong with you? I'm like, But I go through the process. I loved it. When I was a junior, I became cadre. I was one of those cadets that was kind of not beating up, but you were a drill instructor. Fast forward to the summer of '87, I'm in boot camp with Marine drill instructors, real drill instructors.
No, this is officer base.
This is at Quantico. I'm not an officer. I'm a candidate, and I'm going through a 6-week boot camp to see if I make it to become an officer. Because in the Marine Corps, you're expected to be in shape. There's certain things they expect you to know how to do. Because what they're going to do is stress you out and try to figure out if you can't handle the stress of that, you're never going to you'll never be able to handle the stress of combat. So they tried to just put all this sleep deprivation and stress, all these things to get your brain scrambled, and then try to make you make decisions when your brain is scrambled to see if you can make the right decisions. And at one point, I was watching my senior drill instructor scream at another candidate, and he was using phrases that I had used, the previous August and September. I'm there in June of '87, and in the fall of '86, I'm using those same phrases that I've learned from other cadets who've in turn learned them from Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps drill instructors. That's just, yeah. And I get a big kind of smile comes over my face. The assistant drill instructor, small, tough as nails, black guy, staff sergeant, comes at me and starts getting up in my face. Why do I think this is funny? And I just had to wipe the smile off my face and da-da-da-da, and I go through it. Fast forward to I get to my battalion in the summer of March of '89. Both my senior drill instructor and my assistant drill instructor are in my battalion. And when I see them, I have a panic attack. Even though I've been a lieutenant for 9 months at that point. I'm now a second lieutenant. I see these 2 guys that were so a big part of me becoming a Marine, and I meet them and I talk with them, and I realize they're really good staff NCOs, and they were just
Yeah,
doing their
working for you.
job. They were just doing their job, and so anyway. So now I finished my career as a Marine. I was my first platoon. I was a weapons platoon commander, which is like a mortars, machine guns, and rockets that supports the 3 other rifle platoons and an infantry company. Then from there, my second platoon I took over was called heavy guns. I had 6 hardback Hummers with either a Mark 19 or a 50 cal mounted on top, and I had 8 tow vehicles. And what we did is we scouted out in front of the battalion and looked for bad guys, and we would engage bad guys. But then the most important things was us to be able to report back into our battalion operations center, so the colonel and the operations officer could maneuver the battalion in a way to defeat the enemy. And I loved it because I had a ton of autonomy, just like my sergeants liked it because they had autonomy from me because we were all out scouting for the battalion. So I got out after I was in the Persian Gulf I flew over on December 31st, and I got back like in the middle of May. We were in some combat. Listen, there was bullets snapping over my head at times, but I wasn't up on the line. I was in my battalion operations section, so it was a couple of times there was some really scary, stressful things that happened, but nothing like I would compare to Vietnam or what Marines and soldiers went through Afghanistan and Iraq, so but having said that, it still changes you as a person. And then I got out, and my father wanted me to get involved with our pre-press company because he wanted me to take it over. And so when I got out, it did take me a little bit of while to realize dealing with civilians is different than dealing with staff NCOs and sergeants. I can't bark orders at everybody.
That's got to be a major change in how you approach things, right?
It is, and because you just have to learn that you still, one of the things I'd always, and I still say it to this day, is the Marine Corps taught me was the mission is the most important thing, and whatever you decide is the mission. Be it your company being successful, or maybe you could even break it down to something smaller about like we just have to do X, and that everything you do is accomplishing the mission, and everything else goes to the side. And that's something like one of the things even when I was in the service, and then that's one of those things that when I became a civilian, I've been the commander of my American Legion post for 13 years in a row up in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and I constantly talk about to the team that I work with. We're all volunteers, but the mission is advancing the post, and it's not about anything that's what's good for any of us personally. It's always about the mission is more important than any person. And again, we're not charging machine gun nests anymore, and charging a beach and where I'm putting Marines' lives in danger. But you got to always remember that it's not about what's best for you; it's what's best for the company. Because that's most important. Because if the company does well, then you're going to do well. Versus you got to take blinders off that are like when you start thinking about what's best for me. It's never what's best for me.
Right. Well, that kind of translates to the customer side of it too.
Yep, and so when you start talking to customers, it's always about okay, what's best for them. It's not I could talk this guy into doing this more expensive thing that I'm going to make more money on, but maybe that's not going to make that customer come back over and over again because I got to take care of the customer. One of the things I often say to when I'm talking to a prospect for the first time, I'll say, listen, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. And there's things I've seen having worked at little printers, big, national printers, mid-size, and I have a lot of contacts. And I said, you might ask me to do something, and I might say, you know what, I don't do that myself, but I know who does do that, and I'm going to turn you on to them. And then you're going to go work with them. I'm not getting any kickbacks, or I don't want to even be involved in it. And I'm not doing that just for like altruistic reasons. I know that by me being that way, you're going to keep coming back to me for not only, hey, Bob, I got some crazy bindery thing or something, like a big web printing job, and I know where to point you. But you're going to keep coming back to me because I become the shell answer man. And then I can keep helping you. And then and that's how I'm going I'm going to make your life easier and make you happier, but that's also going to benefit me. But it's going to benefit me like in an ancillary fashion because me taking care of you is going to take care of me on the back end versus sometimes salespeople, again, a car dealer tries to sell you things that maybe you don't really need because they're making more money on that. But if you as a salesperson you have to realize that it's always about taking care of the client because by doing that, it's going to grow that relationship. It's also going to allow you to say, hey, I'm at a big university and I'm dealing with the admissions and they love me. And then I'm like, hey, can you introduce me to the advancement people? Because I see them over there. Oh, yeah, that's, and now I always like to use the phrase, I like to eat sideways in an account. I get in, you kind of make, the Marine in me makes a beachhead, but then you start thinking about once you get in, it's not overnight, but you start, you know that there's other groups going on, other pockets of work, and then ask to be introduced to that person because once they know that you're doing a good job, it makes doing that introduction easy.
Well, yeah, you've created goodwill, number one, right? When you talk about the mission first and individual second, if you follow that philosophy, you're going to establish a lot of goodwill, a lot of, sort of relationship capital.
Yep.
And then that creates a fertile ground to grow things.
Yep.
When you say.
Yeah, I agree. That's, and then, like I said, beyond that is like having knowledge. So like this morning I was talking to someone at a hospital, as I mentioned earlier, about like wanting to do some development work, and I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to talk with her on email about it. I'd never met her. I wanted to talk with her, and we talked. And I was like, "Why? What's the goal? Why are you doing this? What are you trying to accomplish?" So once I understand their mission, then I could start to wrap my head around ideas of okay. But then also, even like it was going to be in the case of this job, it was going to be going on for months at a time. Like it could be every month. And one of the things I thought about was, let's do window envelopes because I can print. They want to print these variably, but by printing them variably, and the quantities were such that they lent themselves to doing that. By printing them variably, then putting them in an envelope, I can be a little bit less expensive because you don't have to inkjet. It's not a 2-point match. And then I even said to the customer, hey, I'm going to print 6 months of envelopes in advance because by doing that, I'm going to drive that envelope cost down versus this customer was looking to do anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 pieces a month. Is why the envelope isn't changing,
Right.
Let me print them all in advance. And that's one of those things that I think haven't been around a while that oh, okay, let's figure out the better mousetrap, and by printing those in advance, I'm going to drive that envelope cost down, and it just makes it easier because you're not printing them all the time. It's one less thing you got to do. But most importantly, it's going to make the job easier for the client, and it's going to make, because again, the woman was talking to me about cost, and she's mentioned that a few times, so that rings a bell in my head. So now I'm thinking, how do I do this the least, something that still looks good and it's effective because I still want to get these donations, but yet it's cost effective. And so those are some of the things I thought of that I'll be presenting to her in the next couple of days.
Yeah, so maybe that goes back to your Marine Corps training and your training as a cadet too, where you talk about how do we become the most efficient we can be and get from point A to B as efficiently and as safely as we can. But maintaining that relationship where you create options for your customers.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, as a Marine, the Marine Corps is always one that got when it came to getting things, as it relates to budgets and stuff, the Marine Corps wouldn't always get the best equipment. And the other thing I learned was when they give you that mission, it's never like I can't do it. It's okay. How do I do it with the assets I have? It's often, oftentimes you'll, in the civilian world, having been at some companies, sometimes you'll hear people talk like, oh, you can't do, I don't know how, or I need such and such. But as a Marine, I learned no, you're gonna do it with whatever you got. Now, it may not be as efficient, and it might take you something a little bit longer. I used to do this, maybe back when, we were thinking about getting into digital printing back in the 90s, early 90s, and so sometimes one of the things we might do is print jobs on an offset press at a loss, but at the cost of a digital press to get the business going versus buying the piece of equipment and then if like now you have to wait. Now you're paying the nut of that, whatever that piece of, and they're expensive. You buy a $500,000 press back then, and you're paying it off every month, and yet you don't have the business for it. Well, why not just use the people and like do something and just use the tools that you have, and then once you start to see the business grow, okay, now when I go out to make that investment, I know that I got the work.
It's gonna be full.
And you're gonna like, okay, now I'm gonna, at least I feel like, if not full, but like, okay, I got enough that making the payment and having people hired to run it and maintenance and all that stuff, I'm comfortable, versus bullets sweating off you because you're an owner. And a lot of times when you're in those situations as a printer, because again, I've been on the operations side, I've been a sales manager, and now I'm a salesperson in the field. So I have a lot of experience, and I've seen sometimes those, you understand, sometimes production people can want to put a wall up and they want to, Heisman you, like, oh, we can't do that. And you're like, yeah, I know you can't, because I used to be you. And you just got to bend a little bit.
Right. And
we're bending not just for this one-off job for some small, because this customer is a big potential, and there's all this stuff behind it, and we're competing against other printers. And if we, I was on a call, just to give you an example, I was on a call where somebody asked me that they said, well, can you print some small runs of stuff? And I was like, yeah, I'll print small runs. Yeah, do you have any minimums? And I'm on a call with 5 people, which tells me it was for a big national, like a distributor, and they have an end customer. The fact that they have 5 people all servicing the same end customer tells me that they do a lot of work for this end customer. Mm-hmm. And they were saying, well, like some printers, they don't want to do, a small job, a couple $100 because it's not worth it to them. And I was like, listen, I don't want to just do the couple $100 jobs because it isn't worth. But if you need me to do you a favor or help you out, yeah, I'll 100%, because I know there's the big $1,000, multi-thousand piece runs. Yeah, I can do the small stuff for you. And then within 2 hours, they gave me a quote for doing 7 posters. I'm like, yeah, quoted it, $700. I'm like, okay, I'm not retiring on that sale, but if I get the job and do a good, as one of my sales compatriots here at Hannaford, we've worked together probably since 2009. He always uses the phrase, it's the camel's nose under the flap. Once you get in and you do a good job, now you can start eating sideways and find another business.
Right. And
you just can't. You can't be like, again, going back to that mission, we're like, oh, that job's it's not good for me personally, so I don't want to do it. But then the customer's going to give it to another printer, and maybe that's a new printer. Now that printer's nose is under the flap, and now you're competing against someone that, had you done the job, you would. Again, I love my analogy, my little allegories I have. But you would have kept that wolf out of the hen house,
right? Yeah.
And so that's such sometimes that mentality that you have to have is. It's not just about you, it's about helping the client out.
Well, how are some of the other ways that your military experience, you think, sort of makes you who you are today, or sort of pervades what you do in the civilian world? And how'd you get there?
I'll give you a name. Unfortunately, my mother is about to pass. So I was over her house yesterday, and I was talking to my father, my mother and my father and I, we worked together for so many years together. And my dad was asking me how things were going. And I was like, I'm I've hit some roadblocks here and there, and I've made some good inroads with the customer, like that Pfizer one I was, you heard me talking to a few minutes ago, where like the sales process is just a little bit more delayed. And my dad was like, he was just lamenting some things, and the Marine in me was like, I'm not going to cry in my soup. I'm not going to, be like, oh, woe is me. I'm going to pick myself up by the bootstraps. And I said to him, I'm going to go home tonight, and I'm going to work on some prospecting things, because worrying about stuff that would have, I didn't get that job, or blah, 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 it doesn't get you, it doesn't advance the cause. And I think that's one of the things I learned as an officer was like, when you get your teeth kicked down your throat about something, you had to just keep moving forward. You couldn't, again, you had to accomplish the mission. You had to do even when you got dealt a bad set of cards and you didn't like it. Because again, the military is not unlike being at a really big business, that sometimes things come down that you don't like. I'm not talking about bullets snapping over your head, but I'm just saying, like, again, the Marine Corps is a big part of the government, and it can have these monolithic, and it's always worried about itself, and sometimes it's not as worried about the component parts. And when that would happen, you just can't bitch about it. You gotta move on. Listen, as a Marine, we bitched all the time. But at the end of the day, you're like, I still gotta keep going. I gotta do this. I gotta do that. And I think that's something that translates to, I'm not gonna worry about things I can't control. I can control what I can't control. I'm gonna try to give it 110% to get it done.
And those things you can't control, you still have to plan for them and deal with them, though, right?
No, it's fun. Another thing we used to talk about is when we would plan to do an attack, or whatever. Couldn't just even be just some sort of. And as soon as you stepped off, or as soon as the first, even in a training scenario, the blank, when you're shooting blanks, when that first blank round went off, something changes, and you have to be able to adapt because if the plan's we're going to go up and then we're going to make a right, and then you go to make a right and there's a roadblock on your right that you didn't see, well, you can't pound through the roadblock. You're now going to say, okay, now I got to go left or come up with some other plan. And I think that's something you learn in the service, because as soon as you start to do something, like I said, when you haven't any kind of a plan, you could be a naval ship at sea, and you think we're going from here to there, and then something happens. Stuff breaks on the boat. Refuel a ship isn't going to show up when you wanted it to, and you got to come up with a plan to we still got to get from A to B, but I got to figure out how I'm going to do that, because the stuff that I thought was going to happen isn't going to happen, and that's something you learn in the service. Is stuff changes all the time, and you have to be willing to be nimble with your mind.
Is part of that making a plan A and a B and a C and a D?
We would do that. We would, like I said, we would have plan A's, plan B's, plan C, just like you would as a business owner. I remember back when I had my family's company, I would plan like a 5-year business plan, knowing that sometimes 3 months down the road, something's going to change that might change. But at least by having the plan, you can at least see the vision of where you think you want to get to, versus just kind of stumbling around in the dark and just going day to day to day. Sometimes the sales guys I know, when I talk with them, and when you ask a salesperson in the commercial space to forecast, they'll be like, I don't know what's coming tomorrow. Never mind what's coming, 3 months from now. When I was a sales manager, I'd be like, listen, I get it, but you have some idea. You have, and just, I'm not gonna expect you to be 100% accurate for something that you're going to forecast 90 days from now. And I used to say, I'll expect you to be 80% accurate of something that's going to happen next month, because we're in the middle of June or July, early July right now. I got to believe you have an idea of what's coming in August. So, and then that allows us to have a plan, and then so you can have an A and a B and a C. But even then, you could have all the plans in the world, and then, like I said, as soon as that first thing happens, first bullet snaps over your head, something changes, and you just have to be willing. It's funny, as a lieutenant, when we would be training, we would be like, that's what they would do to us. They would be like, oh, you're going from A to B, and we would have planned off, and I had this big order, and I was, and I had all these ideas, and as soon as we got going, an instructor would come up and say, nope, that's, sometimes what they would do in our training is they would, if I was the lieutenant, they would grab me and say, you're dead. Okay, to the next guy, and my platoon sergeant, okay, what are you going to do? And then he had to learn how to adapt, or they might just say, hey, this vehicle's broken, even if it wasn't. Hey, you can't use it. Come up with the plan. And because they knew that those things happen, and the same things happen in business. Right. People make, talking about having long, business plans, and da-da-da, but as soon, especially in today's world, things change all the time. I
think it was Mike Tyson. Didn't he say everybody's got a plan until they get punched
in the face?
Yeah.
That's again, as a boxer, Rocky had the plan that he was going to, do something, to fight Southpaw, and then he says, you know what? In the original one, he says, I'm just going to let Apollo Creed wear himself out by punching me in the face, which wasn't the plan. Mickey's losing his mind. Yeah. But Apollo realizes, hey, wait a minute, it's working. Yeah. Actually, I take that back. He does that with Clubber Lang in Rocky III. That's what it is, because he realizes he wears them off because he just realizes his original plan wasn't working. And it's the same thing, I think that applies in every kind of a business. I don't care what you're doing, because things are always changing. Mm-hmm. Nothing ever stays the same.
I love what you've been talking about, just in terms of the sales approach and the relationship approach. Tell us a little bit more about Hannaford and Dumas and, exactly what you're doing for customers that brings them value.
Yeah, I think, Hannaford has been in business since 73, and Steve Breyer has owned it the last 20 plus years, and I've bumped into them when I've been at other printers, and I always knew they were a good printer. They always kept, the costs are really, they kind of keep things the way they run things is kind of in a stripped down fashion.
Yeah.
This plant isn't the prettiest plant that I've ever been in, but they print really well, and they turn jobs really fast. The pricing's really good, and this isn't, the 90s or even the early 2000s when customers really go out. Everyone's got so many more hats to wear,
right.
And employers have stripped back employee headcount so much that the days of going to press OKs all the time, not that I came in today, right before you got here, there was a gentleman in here with one of my sales guys on my team, and he was doing a press OK. It happens, but it's definitely like something that went from like, oh, those used to happen all the time to they happen like not as often because everyone, and to be honest, another piece of the puzzle that I think is the printing technology has gotten so much better that printing well is expected. It's still a craft, and you still got to know what you're doing, but it's less relying on the pre-press or the pressman as it is on the technology. So Hannaford does have a lot of technology. They also have a bindery facility up in Nashua, New Hampshire, which is a separate facility, and we bind almost everything we do in-house. And what that allows is keeps your costs down because you're not vending stuff out to other binderies. Every printer that does that marks it up, and then that also means that you have to drive it to the other bindery. You're at the mercy of the bindery as it relates to the turnaround of the job. So us being able to do everything ourselves allows us to turn jobs really fast, keep the costs low, and they look really nice, which that's what clients want. We also here at Hannaford, we have two pieces of gear that I had never seen at like a commercial printer. We're about a $30 million shop. We have about 120 team members. We have an inkjet web, which I've used at big national printers. But it's funny, I was quoting some jobs recently for a customer where they were like, it was a publication run of like 100 and I think it was 126, the page counts were up, but the run sizes were 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. That's right in the wheelhouse of an inkjet web because you're printing in book blocks,
right.
And they come right off the press, and you can either saddle stitch them or perfect bind them. Obviously, if you're doing 120 plus pages, you're perfect binding, and it meets the client's needs, and it just allows you. You get a piece of gear. That's another Marine Corps. He's always referred to equipment as gear, but you got gear that's going to help you compete against other printers that another printer doesn't have. And then as a salesperson, you have to leverage that, make sure you're telling people about it. It's funny, I've listened, sometimes you hear a salesperson might say here, like, I don't like to use that press because of umpty frat, and I'll be like, no, it can be a force multiplier, and it's a way that you can differentiate yourself against another printer. You're doing longer run, variable data stuff where, on an indigo press, it's a sheet fed press. And at some point, once you get into a certain, run level, that inkjet press, the web, the same reason a sheet fed press doesn't compete with an offset web press is because once the page counts or the run size gets up to a certain point, the web press takes over, and the same thing on that inkjet press. So, right. And then also we work at we convert envelopes in house. I've never ever worked at a printer. When I first did a tour 2 years ago here, and my sales manager was taking me through Nashua, and I was like, listen, I know equipment. I'm a sales guy, so I understand it, but I'm not, I'm not like in the weeds. But I see a piece of equipment, and I'm like, what's that thing? Yeah. He goes, oh, that's an envelope converter. I'm like, envelope converter? Like, I always thought those were these big, large machines. And anyway, so because when COVID happened, and I was working at a big, large national printer who's like the second or third largest direct mailer in the country, they don't convert envelopes in-house. And when COVID happened the year after in 21, envelopes, like a lot of things, like paper, became scarce. Steve Breyer bought the converter so he could say, I'm not worried about getting envelopes because I'll make my own envelopes because I can get sheets of paper. Even if I'm just making blank number 10s,
Right.
I can do that. And that's why it's just that having that kind of a mindset as with your owner. Again, he's got the idea of the mission, even though he's not, he's never been in the service, but he's thinking, my customers need envelopes. I can't get envelopes. How do I solve that problem? I go out and I buy this machine, I put it in. Now the mission of servicing clients need envelopes can go forward because I just put this piece of equipment in, and then beyond that, it does window envelopes and foils the envelopes, and obviously you can print, you could print a sheet with a ton of ink on it and then fold it down so the envelope really stands out in the mailbox, which is something when you're talking to your direct mail customers, it's about how do I make my piece stand out in that mailbox so that it gets opened and, that's going to help tweak my response rate.
Well, you've also got a lot of flexibility that way, too, and you can control, when you talk about factors that you can control versus those you can't, that's an important piece.
Yeah, then I would agree with that because that's, having that, the more options, I would say, like, as a salesperson, the more arrows I have in my quiver, that way I can, I love when, and again, as a salesperson, as I've worked at different companies, you learn the strengths and the equipment that the client has or the company has, and then you're like, okay, how can I solve my client's problems with the equipment I have? Because maybe some clients, they might have some, like if a client came to me now and said, oh, I got, really big, I need a 40,000 piece run of a 124 page, I would say, you know what, that's not a good fit for me. You really got to go to a web. And I can point you at a bunch of good web printers that I know here in the New England area. But it's, again, I'm not doing you any favors unless you say to me you're going to run on papers that are heavier and you're doing it's a really high end jewelry catalog or something that you don't want the step down that web offset printing is. But if assuming that isn't the case, then you really should be on a web press. And I'm doing you a disservice by trying to steer you to put money in my pocket versus saying, really, you ought to go send that to a web printer because that's not a good fit for me. And you're really, and that's another thing you have to learn. So if a client says something to you that, that's something that isn't a good fit, that you've got to be willing to point them in another direction, even if it means you might be letting that wolf into the hen house again. But at the end of the day, you're ultimately trying to help the client out. And as long as you're doing that job and you have that relationship, they'll keep coming back to you.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great way to end.
Awesome.
Yeah, very nice. Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. We've been with Bob Stewart from Hannaford and Dumas up in Woburn, Massachusetts. Thanks so much for sharing not only your military background, but all the good stuff you're doing for customers.
Oh, thanks.
In civilian life. So
that was fun.
And this has been Chris Santomassimo, host of the Think Factory podcast.